Oregon is famous for its craft brew culture, and today we'll get to experience that firsthand. Hi, I'm Sarah Shin from Global Human Collective. Today, we'll be visiting a local 10-barrel production brewery in Salem, Oregon, that specializes in English-style beers. We'll hear from the brewers themselves about how they started and why they chose to create a British-style pub here in Salem. During this past year in 2020, the owners supported the community through both the COVID-19 pandemic and the terrible wildfires that affected Oregon. This is one of my favorite Salem breweries, not only because they have fantastic beers, but also because they support community in a positive way. Let's head over to Santiam Brewery to learn about beer tasting vocabulary as we sample their impressive selection of beers. I'm here at Santiam Brewing today with Ian and Jim, two of the owners and brewmasters here at the brewery. So tell us a little bit about how Santiam came to be, how you all got your start.
Back in the 1980s, the late 1980s, when I moved here, there was no real craft brewing scene in America. There was no culture of the craft brew pubs that we have today. It didn't exist. And I didn't like going to the seedy, dark bars that were the forerunners of our great pubs that we have today. And I would stay home and I would brew my own beer. And that way I could brew the fruity ales that I was used to and European-style lagers that I enjoyed. And I didn't have to drink the macro beers that did not appeal to me at all. And as a result of doing that for a number of years, I ran into other craft brewers. And we kind of got together in clubs. We hung out together. I met a small core of craft brewers that became friends. And we would meet up weekly at our little meetings that we used to refer to as choir practice, which was mainly so that we could invite each other over corporate email from our day jobs without tipping off everybody that we were going out drinking at the end of the day. And we would get together every week and we would drink craft ales, many of which we'd made ourselves, and that went on for years. And friends would come and join us, and a universal cry used to be, "Hey, this is great beer. You guys should open up a craft brewery." I think we took that with a grain of salt at first because they were getting free beer. What are they going to say? It sucks. So we listened, and after we'd heard it enough, we said, "Hey, let's open a brewery." And about 10 years ago, that's what we did, and that's Santiam Brewing.
So I can remember coming to Santiam when you had a really small tasting room, back over there. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how you kind of evolved to what you all are now.
When we started, we really were doing it on a shoestring budget. We didn't want it to be the kind of, I think, investment out the gate that would cripple any of us financially. We kind of really started as a hobby business. We were on a 3-barrel system, which is about 100 gallons at a time, or about 6 or 7 kegs. And when we first started, we had the idea that we would just wholesale the beer. We didn't have any designs on any kind of retail operation at all. What we found by the time we opened the doors, or just before they opened the doors, we thought, well, maybe we'll throw in a small bar so we can do some growler fills to go. But we didn't have any idea the demand that we would have for retail business. We had a line of people out the door from day one. And our little bar was clearly insufficient. We had people filtering into the brewery just to get a pint and socialize. And that was a pretty good example of our customers deciding for us what was important. We then expanded into the next space, which was a garage space, gave us a little more production. A few months after that, we expanded a tasting room by about 1,000 square feet. And it just kind of kept knocking down walls in this building until we finally had it all. And it was that kind of incremental and organic growth that got us to the point where we could spring for a larger brew system and expand our reach.
Very cool. I'm wondering can you talk about your beers and what sets your beers apart from others here in the Willamette Valley? What makes your beers so special?
I'll take the first part. I'm going to have Ian talk about the cask beer in particular, but I think for most of us, we didn't really see a need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of the styles we do are very classic styles. They've been around for hundreds of years, and there's a reason for that, in our opinion. So we really focused on developing classic styles of beer and honing down a process where we could get consistency over time, getting that same recipe coming out the way we intend every single time. That's really I think one of the biggest tricks in this business is maintaining that consistency, because things change. The malts change, the hops change from year to year in their bitterness, some of their profile. So it's making those adjustments and knowing where to make those adjustments is really the biggest key. Another big piece of that, though, is cask ale, and that's one thing that differentiates us from others. And Ian knows a lot more about that, having grown up in England. And
yeah, I mean, probably until the 1960s, cask ale was very big in Britain, and then it started to die out a bit. And in the 1970s, and I'll explain what cask ale is in a second, but in the 1970s, there was a movement in Britain called the Campaign for Real Ale. And it completely turned around the brewing scene in Britain. Cask ale had almost died out, and as a result of the Campaign for Real Ale, it was introduced back into Britain and is now the predominant British-style beer that's sold. And what cask ale is you are aware, beer is a carbonated product. It has dissolved carbon dioxide in it. It's a fizzy that gives it the fizzy aspect of the beer. And what happens when you make a beer, most American beer, all the CO2 is just allowed to bubble away into the atmosphere. The beer is completely flat. It's put into another tank. It's usually filtered. It's fined, meaning that there are products that are put in to collect all the particulate matter out of the beer, which settles out, is dumped out the bottom, it's filtered. And then after they've taken all of those things out of the beer, they force carbon dioxide back into it under pressure, and they put it in a sealed pressurized keg, and then they use more CO2 to force it out under CO2 pressure to your tap, and they pour your tap, and then you get this fizzy product. Well, the interesting thing is when beer ferments, there's two byproducts from the fermentation process. One is CO2, and the other is alcohol. Well, you don't get rid of the alcohol. Why are we getting rid of the CO2? So what happens in a cask ale is before you put all these finings in it and removes all the particulate matter, many of which are flavor components in beer, what you do is you put that beer into a sealed container called a cask. You add a little bit more sugar, usually malt sugar, to allow fermentation to continue, but you don't allow the CO2 to leave. So it continues to be produced inside the cask. It has nowhere to go, so it's dissolved back into the beer. Then all of the byproducts of that fermentation are allowed to settle in the bottom of the cask. They're called the lees, and they also add flavor. And the beer is kept, it's not warm, but it's not bone-chillingly cold like most American-style beers are. It's kept at what we call room temperature, which is about 10 to 12 degrees Celsius. And so that allows the beer to continue to be alive. The yeast in it is alive. It's not killed. It's not filtered out. And that adds to the fruity component and the flavor of British-style ales. Well, a lot of Americans, they go to Britain and they joke about how warm the beer is. And it's funny, when I visit my friends in Britain and they ask me if I want a beer, it doesn't come out of the fridge. They just open the cupboard and pull a bottle out and open it. It's what I grew up with. It's warm. It's cold in Britain. It's colder than it is here. So it's cooler than what we think of as room temperature, but it's not bone-chillingly cold beer. So the flavor, cold is also a flavor restrictor. So you've got a little bit higher temperature. It allows you to taste the beer better. You've got all the fruity components because you've not got all that particulate matter out of the beer. You've just allowed it to settle to the bottom of the cask, but it still contributes to the flavor. So you get these very flavorful, fruity beers. But because there's no CO2 and you can't just pull the tap and have the CO2 pressure force the beer out, you have to actually pump it out with a beer engine. And you've seen those on our bar, those 4 beer engines. Well, we never set out to create a British style pub, but anybody that's been to a British style pub in Britain, the first thing you see when you're going, you see this row of beer engines where they pull the beer out of the casks. So when people, and you see we've got flags around the brewery, we've got American flags, Irish flags, a British flag. The British flag just happens to be the one that's behind the bar. It just happened to fit there better. And then the cask engines on top, and everybody said, "Oh, it's a British pub." And we rolled with it. It wasn't a conscious effort, but we kind of rolled with that. So that cask ale is a big part of our identity. The style of beer is a big part of our identity, and it does coincide. And I happen to be from Britain, which I'm sure adds to the illusion. And so here we are in a British style pub drinking British style ales made by a British guy.
And you kind of mentioned like trying to find what contributes to that identity. And it's kind of like the journey with figuring out what to serve or what kind of food to serve.
Yeah, I think it started with the cask ale, as you mentioned. That was really identifier for anyone that lived in Britain as an expat or spent any significant time there. It's something that I think attracted them here. So we already had that customer base. When we started food, we thought we both like barbecue, and we thought, well, maybe that'd be a good place to go. But we just didn't really have the demand for it that warranted the cost, especially in time and product. And as we went back to the drawing board, Ian, I think, got kind of inspired by some of the things that he liked to cook at home, because coming from Britain, he couldn't get a lot of those things. So he had to either go without or make them. He ended up making them. But we already had kind of that customer base, I think, from the cask ale. We turned on the British food, and it just took off from that point. It was immediately popular, and it really, I think, kind of helped solidify that identity.
And we incorporate our beers into some of those dishes, like we do, the British savory pies are the meat pies served with chips or fries. We call them chips in Britain. And so fish and chips, pie and chips. But the steak and ale pie, for example, has our Spitfire ale and our Cole Porter in it. We make a beer cheese, which is made from the Pilsner that we make. And so incorporating, this beer that I have right in front of me, the Sassenach, which is a Scottish-style single malt beer, is in the lamb shank pie that's in the oven right now. And so that is just something that we do as part of our cooking as a flavor component, is incorporate the beers that we make.
So if you wanted to, if we were at home and wanted to drink one of your beers, how would one go about getting beers? Do you sell them as stores? Are you selling them in Oregon or outside of Oregon?
We sell in Oregon and Washington presently. The COVID has definitely put a little bit of a damper on where we sell and how much of it goes out the door. But we do sell cans to a number of stores, particularly in Salem, Portland, and Vancouver, Washington, and keg product in those same cities as well.
Prior to COVID, we were distributing our beers as far south as Ashland, out to the coast, up to Astoria, Portland, out
Seattle.
to Bend, Seattle, Vancouver, Olympia, places in between. Our COVID has reduced our wholesale beer by over 90%. We anticipate we've managed to survive financially through what we hope is the main effects of COVID, and that is something that we intend to move back into, is our wholesale distribution across the state, and that is cans and keg beer for bars and restaurants.
I'm wondering if you can tell us how the craft beer scene has really changed here in Oregon since you started, or maybe even before you started brewing, or maybe when you started brewing, from that time until now.
Well, I think Oregon's early days in craft beer, I think, really started around the mid to late 80s. Deschutes was one of the first big ones that came in. Full Sail was another one. Those are what they call Class of 88 breweries. But they certainly inspired me as young 20-something coming out of college. That got my first taste for craft beer. But they were only one of a handful of breweries that were going into the 90s. There was a bit of a dip in, or a bit of a recession in terms of beer during the 90s. That started to have a bit of a resurgence about mid-2000s. And by the time that we were discussing, becoming a brewery and actually putting up money to make it happen, we were one of about 100 breweries in the state. Since we opened our doors almost 10 years ago, it's now over 270 or 280 breweries in the state. So there's a lot more players. A lot of them are small, smaller than we are. We usually sit somewhere in the 60 to 80 range on the production list for the state.
So of that 260, that means 200 of them are smaller breweries than this.
Yeah.
And we're a fairly small brewery. Our brew system is 12 hectoliters, 1,200 liters. Our first brew system that we started was about 5 hectoliters, less than half that. And many of the breweries that are around now are well under 5 hectoliters. Some are as small as, they make 2 kegs in one batch, 2 50-liter kegs. So it's a big change. They're the big breweries. They're obviously huge. They dominate. But for us, pre-COVID, we were up to about 30 employees. And that's 30 jobs. We contributed significantly to the Oregon economy, and the brew scene in Oregon does. What is it, like $1.5 billion? Is it the estimate?
Well, I think it's more than that. I think they estimate over 2.
Okay.
And pre-COVID, we were producing as much as 1,500 barrels in a year, which is, I think, roughly
about 1,800.
It's about 45,000 gallons. It's a lot. So, and that, as we mentioned, it had that footprint for distribution to get to all that beer out.
Yeah, the gallon's about 1.2 hectoliters, so it's about 1,800 hectoliters.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's really unique about Santiam, is for the atmosphere and community that you've built, and we'll come and we'll see people play darts or, playing games or chatting at the bar, and it seems like people know each other. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about just like the community that you've all have built and we see here.
I grew up in Britain, and for me as a child, it was a very familiar experience to go out with my parents on the weekend. We'd drive to a country pub. We'd sit there. My parents would drink beer. I didn't have a beer until I was probably 16, which was the drinking age in Britain back then, provided that you were having food and you were with your parents. And it was a very normal, occurrence for me. And when I first moved to the States, we used to call it the pub, which is short for the public house, the place where the house that the public would meet in and congregate as a community. And those places didn't really exist. They used to exist 100 years previously, pre-Prohibition. There were places like that, but the lack of that was part of the cultural devastation of Prohibition, almost 100 years ago now. And what happened as the craft brewer scene grew, the importance of craft beer within the community changed. And instead of being this windowless den that you would, hide in, and it was just not a sort of a reputable place that you would want to go to, they were kind of seedy. Now we use the term pub did not really exist in America in the late 80s when I moved here. And I very rarely heard the term. Now it's a common term. Let's meet up at the pub. I hear people say that all the time, and it's that British term, the public house. And it means just that. It's the place of community. And that has been one of the major changes in the craft brew scene, is reintroducing drinking beer as a social thing to do. It's as we call it, a social lubricant, it allows people to be more friendly and open up a little more, be less sort of tight and reserved as a result of having a couple of beers. And it allows community to chat and enjoy their week's experiences with each other. And we have many groups of people that clearly meet up after work or they meet up at the weekend. And that's exactly what a pub's supposed to be for, to enjoy a beer, to enjoy company and community. And we have 3 taglines on our Facebook post. It's beer, community, and food. And the community is a very, very big part of it. All 3 work together to keep the community together, enjoying each other's company and enjoying a good beer.
That's actually how we approach a lot of our a lot of projects, a lot of problems, a lot of opportunities that we come across is we kind of circle back to those three words: craft beer, community, and food, and figure out how the problem, the project, or the opportunity fit into that dynamic. That's very important to us. It kind of helps us keep us on task, keep us focused with what we're trying to do.
I remember in late 2020 when the wildfires were happening and you all did fundraisers and were making food for people who were displaced by the wildfires. That was a great example of how you were supporting the community.
Yeah, we actually, we were shut down. And because of the fires, the air quality was so poor, we couldn't get to work. And I just drove down one morning and to the fairgrounds, and I said, "Hey, anything you guys can do? I've got a commercial kitchen. Oh, we need breakfast." And then I called you. What did I say?
They needed lunch. They needed sandwiches. And I remember sitting there. I mean, just looking at the sky, it was eerie. The entire sky was this
red.
Orangish red, and it just inundated with smoke. And I was feeling actually a bit depressed about the whole situation. I knew we weren't open. I knew we couldn't open. And I got a call from Ian saying, "Hey, I just went down to the fairgrounds. I need 200 sandwiches in 3 hours. Can you come help me?" Yeah, I'm on my way. And that was, it was just another one of those things that kind of helped us circle back to, yeah, this is something we can do. It was actually quite empowering to be in the face of what was going on and knowing there was something we could do to help.
We put a Facebook post out there. "Hey, we're making sandwiches for the evacuees. Because of COVID, we're kind of broke and we need some help. Can anybody help contribute money for food for making sandwiches and breakfast?" And we got $12,000 in 24 hours.
Is there anything the community can do for you all? I know times are really hard, being in a time of COVID. What can we do for you?
Eat out, delivery, pick up if you don't want to sit inside. Sit on the patio if you're not ready to come inside yet. We understand that. Just keep supporting us, and if you can't support us, support some of the other small restaurants and businesses and breweries in the area. Keep the industry alive. We've lost 15% of our restaurants so far, and we're likely to lose a few more. And it's clear from the what happened during COVID that eating out is a big part of people's lives because. I think we got an experience of that. People that don't normally cook have been cooking for months and months, and they're tired of it. The day we opened up, we got slammed, and we don't have the staff because we had to have the business before we could afford the staff. So it was tough for a couple of weeks, but we're still trying to find employees to expand, and that's tough now too. But that's just another aspect of this pandemic. But we are slowly digging out of it, and the community is supporting that and helping, and that's really important. Don't underestimate the importance of going out, even if it's just to have a couple of beers and an appetizer. It really helps.
Yeah, and that was something we found really throughout the pandemic. We constantly, as I mentioned, focused on those things: beer, community, and food. And community was always the hardest thing throughout what was going on for us to really wrap our heads around, and how can we serve the community? And it kind of left us feeling like we were falling short all the time. And it's not that we didn't do anything. We did. We opened up online groceries. We moved our trivia night, which is used to pack this place out.
That was a big thing.
Yeah. So we used to have every Wednesday night we'd have trivia in here. Place to be packed. About 100 people in here, all having a great time, drinking, eating, that kind of thing. We couldn't have anyone in here when that hit. So then we started thinking about what can we do to continue this. And so we moved it online. It's on Zoom. It's still going on every Wednesday. It's free to play.
So the trivia is basically like a quiz show. So we would have a host in who would come and ask questions, and people would congregate in teams, and they would answer the questions on a piece of paper. And then at a break and several times during the round, he would come out and mark the score, and there'd be a gift card for the winning team. Well,
and bragging rights.
Yeah, and we couldn't do that. So now we actually do that online on Zoom. We break people out into the teams. We ask the same questions. we get busy because you get bonus points. If you can crack a Santiam beer during the game, you'll get an extra point or something. So, yeah, we try and keep it alive. And the big investment for us on that is investing in our brand, keeping our brand identity alive with customers who may not have been here for a year, but they hear about us every week because they're signing in. We get 70 to 100 people signing in every Wednesday night to play trivia. And one day, we hope that they'll be back here.
And it happens to be one of our busier delivery nights as a result. So what we found, I mean, that's a good example of something that was kind of, it took a little thinking to try and get it to where we were still serving that sense of community, but the community also responded. And that was a thing that I think we learned most over this year. It's not just about what we do, it's about what our community does and how they respond as well. And it really is a symbiotic relationship. And something that I kind of took for granted coming into the year. I certainly don't anymore. So.
If you came in, what would you choose to drink? What's your go-to beer?
For me, it really depends on the season. If it's 90 or I guess rather, in the 30s or 40s, then the Pilsner is my go-to. It's light, it's crisp, it's easy drinking, and it's refreshing. When it's in the single digits, then it's usually stout season or porter or something along those lines.
Yeah, we have two types of customers, broadly speaking, that come in for beer. We've got the guy that comes in and all he'll drink is Ecotopia, our flagship IPA. And if we don't have Ecotopia, he goes into a depression, at least for the first couple of beers. And then we have the other type that come in and say, hey, what's new? Or give me a flight of a little bit of everything. And so I probably fall into the latter. I like, right now, I have in front of me a cask ale of the single malt Scottish ale, which is made from Scottish malts. And we actually have some heather in it. In Scotland, in the 18th century, England stopped selling the Scottish hops. They don't grow in Scotland. It's too far north. So the Scots would bitter their beer with other components such as heather and ginger. And so we have a lot of heather in this beer, which is the bittering component. So it's a very different character. I wouldn't like to have two of those. I really enjoy drinking one, and then I'll move on to, maybe another beer. And the hazy beer is anything very fruity. For many years we would use all these techniques to remove the haze from beer because brewing crystal clear beer is a height of brewing skill that you try and achieve. And then all of a sudden these murky beers became popular, and it's like, I don't know how to make a murky beer. I've been making it clean. So we come up with all these techniques now for getting the haze. And really what you're getting with haze is the particulate matter, the particles in the beer. You're trying to keep them in suspension. So they refract the light, and you can't see through the beer. And we've achieved that. A lot of that we do with hop particulates. We have a lot of hops that are in suspension in the beer. Sometimes if you leave the beer in the keg too long, all those particulates will settle out in the beer. So when we deliver that beer, we deliver it upside down. And so when the bar comes to tap it, they've got to tip it up the right way, and it mixes it all up again in the keg. So little things like that. So yeah, I like to vary the beer. We're also a winery, which allows us to make cider. We actually don't make wine. Cider is technically a fruit wine. So we need a cidery license to make, we need a winery license to make cider. So we do two kinds of cider: dry cider, which means all the fruit sugars have been fermented away. There's very little left. So it's just the flavor and the water and the alcohol. And then what we do is, we pasteurize it, which kills the yeast, and then we can add fruit like pear juice, and that's what we call back sweetening. That adds a sweetening component to it, and so that's not as dry. So we have a dry apple cider, and then we have a semi-sweet apple cider, but the back juice to sweeten it was pear, so it has a pear flavor to it. So that's another cider that we make. So that's something that we do in addition to the craft beer. It's the craft cider scene, which is also a growing component to the economy here.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you all about that you'd like to say about Santiam?
One of the things that makes Salem beers unique in Oregon and in fact, much of the part of the world, is that our water is what they call very soft. Soft water is water that does not have dissolved salts in it. Water is a huge component of beer. The main components of beer are the water, the barley or the grains that we malt to extract the sugars from them, the water and the yeast. The water here is very smooth. It adds a very different characteristic to the beer that you find in very few other beers. You can add salts to water. It's very hard to remove them. You need things like reverse osmosis or distillation to get the salts out of the water. Hard water adds a very different character to all beer. There is a place in Britain called Burton-on-Trent that is well known for its very hard water. It's got a lot of dissolved salts in it. We can recreate a beer from Burton-on-Trent by adding magnesium and chalk and other minerals that we can add to the water to make the water hard. But they can't do anything with their water without expensive equipment to make it the soft water that we have in Salem. Soft water is very, very good for making European-style pilsners, particularly Czech pilsners. So that's why our Czech pilsner is a really authentic style, because we have a very soft water to start with. But we can recreate the hard water by adding a lot of mineral salts to the water to reproduce the characteristics of other parts of the world that have different water tables. So that is something that's unique to Salem, and it's something that here at Santiam we take advantage of. And that's why we got a lot of different characteristics in our beer, because that's part of the process that we engage in making these authentic style ales that we're proud of, and the lagers too.
And that water comes from the Santiam River, which is our namesake. Which is, I think, it's further evidence as to how important that is to us. That is our identity. And Salem does have some of the best water in the country.
Another thing that we're quite proud of, and it's a silly little thing, but it's just fun, and that in America we have states have emblems. These are things that are suggestive of the characteristics that are important to each state. For example, in Oregon we have the state tree, which is the Douglas fir. We have the state fish, which is the salmon, and there are about 20 or 30 of these different emblems. We have cranberries is the state berry, and one of the things that the legislator wanted to add was a state microbe. And the only reason they wanted to add the microbe is because brewing beer was very popular in Oregon, and it was an easy bipartisan bill that they could introduce. That who's going to oppose beer as a state microbe? So brewer's yeast, which is a microbe, was introduced as the state microbe. And they had to give evidence. The committee that came up with this had to give evidence before the House and the Senate as to why they should adopt the state microbe. And the Craft Beer Caucus, which is the committee that does this, that meets at the legislature, were regulars here. And so they came to us and asked us to give evidence. And that is kind of nice, because that evidence that we gave for this to happen now goes down in the state record. And if you Google it, it comes up, the speech that we gave. And that has basically put Santiam into the state archives forever. That'll always be there. And that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for taking the time today. I learned a lot about Santiam. There's so much more that you all do for the community and everything you do. So thank you so much.
Thank you.